If you have any other questions though, please, I'd rather you ask them sort of now and confront me on something rather than call me out in an article.
Could you please tell us your name, degree, and year of study?
Sure. My name is Ben Hines. I'm studying a combined commerce law degree and I'm in my 6th year.
What is your campaign colour and slogan?
Sure. My campaign colour is gold and my slogan is Bring Ben Back.
And who is your campaign manager?
I'm managing my own campaign.
Cool. And what's your favourite USU outlet?
Oh, I'm going to say Abercrombie. I'm a big fan of ginger fish there.
Cool. The first question is, how would you describe your politics?
Yeah, sure. I think this is a good question. In terms of how I would describe my politics, if I had to sort of sum it up, I would say my politics are progressive. And I know that's probably going to get us some follow-up questions here. But I think when I say that, I don't mean progressive in a buzzword sort of sense. I think it's important when we describe our politics to sort of look at how that manifests in sort of our policies and sort of how we act and things that we do. I think in terms of my politics, sort of the best way to describe them is through examples of things that I've done, particularly I guess in student life is a good one. I think it's probably not that helpful if I go through sort of my economic politics in sort of general. In terms of my politics manifesting in student life and in positions, I'd looked at my time on the USU board and I think my record there would demonstrate a certain element of progressiveness. So for example, as treasurer, I instituted the inaugural ESG investment review, and under my sort of time in that role, the USU implemented the investment policy where it barred certain investments and sort of had to only invest in investments that were in line with its sort of ethical mandate. On top of that, during my time as SALS president, I think a major emphasis for the 2022 SALS executive was inclusivity, it was accessibility, and it was really giving a voice to everybody. I mean, we hosted events from the Ramadan Iftar dinner, we hosted the Roe v. Wade panel, SALS made statements in solidarity with the strikes. So I think those are probably good indicators for where my politics.
Are there any factions you're a part of now or in the past?
So I am not a member of any faction, nor have I been. I'm not a member of any political party. However, in the past, I was a member of the Liberal Party.
Why did you leave and when did you leave?
Sure. I left, I think it was about 2.5 years now ago. And I left because I joined the Liberal Party when I was sort of 17 years old. And it was a very different time, and obviously I was a very different person at that point in time. And as time progressed, I realised that the politics of the party weren't aligned with my own. And so I didn't want to be a part of the party at that time.
Why are you running for USU?
Sure. I think my answer to this question is framed first in terms of why am I running for USU, but also I guess adding the word why am I running for USU again, I think is probably the salient point there. In my mind, the issues facing campus and students in 2023, they're immense. We have rising costs of living issues, we have the return to campus for not just international students, but many students returning to campus, and that poses a whole raft of challenges. It poses accessibility challenges, that poses inclusivity challenges, it poses cultural challenges for the university. And I think the sort of ultimately, those issues are incredibly pressing. I think students will deal with them every day, and I think lots of students will be affected by them in substantial ways, and I think that will happen immediately. And I think ultimately the USU, given the amount of money it has, given the power it has, given the programs that it runs, has an immense capacity to benefit the lives of those students. But I think to do so, it needs to do so immediately, it needs to do so effectively. And I think for me, why I would run again is I have a vision and I have policies that I want to implement because I think they will be beneficial to students in that sense.
Has that vision changed since last time? Why do you feel that you now need more time to execute that? Were you unable to execute that last time?
Sure. I think there are kind of two parts to that. Has it changed and what's different this time? So in terms of has it changed, yes and no. So there are elements of my policy platform last time that I would love to implement again and I would still stand 100% behind. But obviously 2023 is not 2020. I think the year on board that I had in 2020 and even 2021, ultimately there are great policies that all candidates ran on. But the main pressing issue that faced the USU during those times was COVID. The USU's main focus was solvency, was staying afloat essentially. It wasn't on implementing as many policies as we can, spending money on major things that would assist students during that time because ultimately COVID was that major factor. So I think, has it changed? Not necessarily. There are some things that may not be exactly the same in my policy now, but they're also contextual. So I think in 2023, like I said, the USU is in a position to enact meaningful support for students to address things like the cost of living crisis. The USU is in a position to provide, I think one of my main areas of policy platform this time is the support element. Things like an equity scheme, things like providing for financially disadvantaged students that just wasn't in a position to do so before. And I think seeing the nature of the challenges that students are going to face over the next sort of few years, during what would hopefully be my time on board if I were elected, those are the pressing challenges that I really want to address, and I think I am in the best position to be able to address.
So talking about having institutional knowledge that you didn't have last time around, how does that sort of gel with your idea of making running for board easier and more accessible? And why shouldn't everyone run again if everyone gets these 2 years of institutional knowledge?
Sure. Okay, so I'll start with the end of that question and then go back to the start. So in terms of people running again, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think there are structural issues that would stop that are different from the other structural issues. So for example, most degrees at this university are 3 years or 4 years. If you run in your second year, you're graduated by the time that you finished. So I think in terms of why shouldn't everybody run again, I think it's not necessarily a feasible thing that everyone would run again, but I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that some people would run for a second term. That's not to say that everybody should or everybody could. So then in terms of the structural barriers and how that marries up with the first part of my policy platform, I think to me running again is for the reasons I've outlined already. I think there's a unique set of circumstantial challenges that I think bringing that institutional knowledge now and at this time is critical for. I'm not saying that won't be the case in future, but it's necessarily the case now. Structural barriers that exist for other people running for USU that I want to address are structural barriers that look like candidates who haven't had engagement with the USU election before, either not wanting to run because they don't know how, or not having the knowledge of how campaigning works, and then running or seeing other candidates run in similar situations and not do so well and therefore not being able to run.
Do you support the uni closing the USU significantly supporting the strikes and taking other activist stances publicly, quite forcefully?
Yeah, I mean, yes, to answer your question, yes. I mean, I mentioned before sort of what I've done during my time as Sol's president. When we were in Sol's, we shut down our office, we didn't come to campus, we put out statements, and our executive was on the picket lines. And I think the USU as a student union is able to do that. I don't think it conflicts, as some people claim, with legislative requirements for charity. I don't think that's the case. I think the USU should be supporting those strikes.
Do you think the USU has a transparency problem, and would you do anything to change that?
Yes, and to an extent, yes, caveat. What I mean is, I think the USU, compared to other organizations, does a good job. I think it consistently has comprehensive minutes, comprehensive reporting, and all of those are available to members. That said, recently, for example, on the new USU website, I can't find anything that I wanted to find to prepare for my quiz or my interview. I had to go and find things, from my time on board. I had to go and check my AGM speech to find out what the financial revenue of the USU was in 2021. It's not like, I don't know what's happened to the website, and I think the new website is not as good as the old website, and I think the information on the new website is not as good as it was, and I don't know why. And I agree that needs to be improved, and I think it needs to at least go back to what it was before. So I think in terms of, the USU is comparatively a decently transparent organization, but it's become worse, and I think it needs to do better as a result. I guess the second element of that question, I don't know if you're going towards things like in-camera discussions. Obviously, I can't talk about what I've experienced in in-camera discussions, but I think often in-camera, for people who haven't been on board and for candidates, is used as sort of an escape to be like, the USU goes in camera, therefore there's no transparency. I don't think that's the case. I think often the things discussed in camera are not things that are discussed in camera in order to keep them away from the eyes of the members, where that would be a transparency issue. Very often, I mean, we introduced a policy about the in-camera policy when I was on board, which meant that every time you go in camera, you have to justify why you're going in camera. I think that needs to be done better by the chair of those meetings. I think it's very tokenistic when it's done now. But often you'll hear the phrase, we're going in camera to discuss commercially sensitive information or information commercial in confidence. And that's because realistically, you can't discuss things like terms of tenancy that you have with your individual tenants, let's say Wentworth, publicly and let everyone else, sort of all the other tenants, know about that, or all the people in the general world, because that affects sort of your negotiating capacity in like a business sense. So very often, the information that actually is discussed in camera by the USU, I think has to be, you can't not discuss that in camera, just from a feasibility standpoint. That said, I think that needs to be communicated far more clearly. And I think, for example, just saying we're going in camera because of commercially sensitive information isn't enough. And I think that's something that needs to be tackled. But I think the main areas of transparency issues that I see in the USU right now are things like the reports not being on the website anymore.